Last time on Armored Skeptic.
13,000 years ago, it began. Thoth, Ra, and Aragot were to create a global complex that was able to build a synthetic Christ consciousness grid. Many governments of the world, especially the Russian and US governments, were studying our grids back in the 60s and probably earlier. You find little military bases on many of the nodal points of the grid. They were trying to take control of the grid, because if you control consciousness, you control what we think and feel.
And now, the conclusion. Where am I? The last thing I remember, I was falling?
We're on target. Oh my god, I don't want to die.
Wait, what am I doing? I can't die. Before canceling my gym membership.
Are you f***ing kidding me?
They're obviously just gonna drain my account. I mean, they've overcharged me so many times. It's just the principle of the thing, you know?
There's an overload building up in the core. I can contain it, but quantum radiation is leaking throughout the ship. It's wreaking havoc with my navigation controls. The computer doesn't know where we are.
Boys, what's happening?
We're phasing in and out of position in space-time.
Trippy. Where's the ship? I need to find my minions. Maybe they landed around here too. Shit. There's no 5G out here? The first half of Jordan's video is just riddled with nonsense. The second half, on the other hand, is where all the juicy stuff lies.
According to Thoth, he built the Great Pyramid, not the Egyptian king Cheops.
Why would you believe that? I agree that we have sufficient reason to be skeptical of the claim that Khufu, also known as Cheops, built the Great Pyramid. I mean, the evidence supporting that argument is pretty weak. But we have no reason to believe that it was anyone but humans that built the pyramids.
Interestingly enough, Edgar Cayce also channeled that the pyramids were constructed in this time.
Is that interesting, though? Is it?
The pyramids were also found to be built from the top down. The stones on top were placed first, which has baffled researchers ever since.
No, nobody believes that. That doesn't even make any sense. The pyramids are sitting on bedrock, for Christ's sake. How would you even shimmy in those rocks on the bottom?
If what Thoth says is true, well, that explains everything.
What do you mean by if? Isn't Thoth a god, Jordan? Why wouldn't you trust him?
Thoth and friends constructed an entire network of temples and structures along this grid fourth dimensionally. The creation of all of the sacred sites on the planet were no accident. It was a single consciousness that created them all, from Machu Picchu to Stonehenge to Zaghuan.
Again, you're sort of right. I must admit that I too am perplexed by many of the similarities I see in megalithic sites across the globe. Whether it be architectural similarities, death ritual purposes, or star and sun alignments. But it doesn't make a lot of sense that they all came from the same people. It's much more likely that these cultures all evolved from the same religion. Probably whatever religion they practiced at Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known megalithic site.
Although the Great Pyramid was done all at once, many of these ancient structures of the world were made fourth dimensionally and slowly dropped in frequency until they manifested on the third dimension over a long period of time.
I hate to break it to you, but they're still connected to the fourth dimension. We're all in the fourth dimension.
A hot topic of discussion right now are ley lines. These are simply geometric relations between sacred sites. Archaeologists are now finding these huge connections between major spiritual sites in the globe, and now we know why they're connected.
That ley line thing is mostly nonsense. You don't really get perfect geometric shapes when you connect these sites together. And the sites that do line up, again, seem to line up because of religious purposes and not because of any practical reason.
Think of the physical sites as the wiring of a giant wireless electrical system, and then it needs about 13,000 years of continuous energy flow for it to actually turn on.
Boy, that's convenient. That's the exact amount of time we needed. It's funny how things like that work out.
Not only has Thoth told us this in person, but he's also written it down in the Emerald tablets. These tablets were left in the Great Pyramid thousands of years ago.
There was supposedly one emerald tablet that was found by a philosopher named Apollonius of Tyana. He spun a tall tale in one of his books about how he found the tomb of Hermes, and there's all sorts of different interpretations of what it's supposed to mean. But here's the clincher though, the tablet is supposedly written in Phoenician, and the reason that's important is because Phoenician was developed around the 15th century BC, which is about 1500 years after the Great Pyramid supposedly was built.
Formed from a substance created through alchemical transmutation. They are imperishable, resistant to all elements and corrosion. Their atomic structure is fixed in place, and no change can ever take place. In that respect, they violate the material laws of ionization.
They also seem to be immune to study, because despite the fact that they're so indestructible, nobody can seem to produce these tablets.
These tablets share a great wisdom, and you can read them at over 100 different levels of consciousness, and you will always understand them differently.
Oh cool, then just show me where they are.
As you can probably tell, Thoth plays a pretty large role in what happened.
Yeah, I noticed his name come up a lot.
Most of this information comes from him.
I think you mean a lot of information comes from this guy. You know, I find it a little surprising that even Yoon would put this much stock into a single person's testimony. I know you like to believe in a lot of nonsense, but come on.
Considering the quality and quantity of information that he has shared, it makes you really start considering that this next part can be true.
Okay, again, you hint that you know that this story might not be real, but you put the onus on Thoth, and not the weirdo in the ponytail that says he's Thoth.
The Great Pyramid has a legendary missing capstone. According to the Emerald Tablets, deep under the Great Pyramid there's a room called the Hall of Records. This room was not built by Thoth and long predates the Atlantean civilization.
Okay.
Within the Hall of Records is the capstone of the pyramid, which is 5.5 inches high, solid gold, and completely holographic image of the Great Pyramid. It has all of the little rooms and everything.
What the hell would be the point of putting it down there? It's actually much more likely that Rome or some other conquering empire ended up taking the 3 capstones as a trophy.
This leaves us with a 24 square foot piece of the Great Pyramid that's missing. If what Thoth says is true, that missing piece actually belongs to a very special airship.
What now?
And the way to the airship is through the Sphinx.
Of course it is.
The Sphinx, according to Thoth, is not 12,000 years old, but dates back over 5.5 million years on Earth.
Geologists and Egyptologists have been debating about the age of the Sphinx for quite a while now. There's definitely some inconsistencies with the amount of water and wind erosion on the Sphinx, as well as the surrounding quarry it was carved from. And there simply is not enough time between when the Sphinx was supposedly built till now to account for all that erosion. But 5 million years is beyond parody.
About 1 mile down is a round room. Inside this room is the oldest synthetic object on Earth. It's about 2 city blocks in size. It's round like a disc and has a flat bottom and top. It is also only about 3 atoms thick, except for a pattern on the top and bottom which looks like this. This pattern is 5 atoms thick.
Okay, I take it back. There's an equal amount of nonsense in this half.
Thoth says that it's powered by consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, and connects with your own living Merkaba, which means that it becomes an extension of you and your own energy fields. This ship can only be used by the purest of souls.
Well, that goes without saying.
Thoth built the pyramid the way he did to fit with the ship. The disc ship has a circumference equal to the perimeter of the Great Pyramid. Whenever that ratio appears, life occurs.
Okay, I see what happened here. You heard 2 completely conflicting stories about the capstone, and you decided, oh, they must both be true.
Whenever we approach the point in the precession of the equinox where our poles do these shifts, we become very vulnerable. Things often degenerate, and while things become chaotic, there are often other species who wish to take us over. This has always happened, not just with us, but with all evolving consciousness. Every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship and raise it into the air. The Earth and Sun will connect with that person and give him or her great power. The ship is also intimately connected with the spirit of the Earth and is the protector for the whole planet. Every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship and raise it into the air.
And apparently it protects the Earth from everything except for comets and Martians.
Think about it. If consciousness is the primary core component of the entire planet, does it not make sense that it would have its own defense mechanism?
I don't understand the logic of that train of thought at all.
Every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship and raise it into the air. The Earth and Sun will connect with that person and give him or her great power. Then, whatever that person thinks and feels will happen.
Great, more omnipotent people? Jordan, you need to learn the basics of good story writing.
Our takeover event actually already happened, the same year the Christ grid was activated. The year was 1989, and we were having some troubles with the Greys, a race of ETs who were slowly plotting takeover. A very pure woman in Peru made the ascension process into the Christ consciousness grid and found the ship. She tuned it to the frequency of the 4th dimension where she raised it through the Earth and into the air, and manifested a situation for the Greys to leave.
So she finds a ship that lets her do whatever she can imagine, and she decides to do what?
The Greys began getting sick, and remained sick for as long as they stayed here. They have been forced to leave for now, and we are once again safe.
Well, that's boring.
After completing the complex in Egypt, Thoth and pals returned to Atlantis, where they waited for about 200 years until that critical point on the precession of the equinox where the poles would shift. When Thoth first saw signs of the polar shift, they returned to the land of Chem and raised the warship into the sky. They went to Atlantis and picked up the Nacals. The Nacals weren't just passengers though, and each and every being was working in unity to create a very powerful Merkaba around themselves and the ship.
I don't get it. If the pilot of the ship can just manifest whatever they want, why would they need any help at all?
And then, it happened. The poles began to shift, and human consciousness began to plummet. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic and magnetic fields of the Earth collapsed, and all life on the planet went into the Great Void, the 3.5 days of absolute blackness described by many ancient cultures in the world.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that's what they meant. Besides, if the electromagnetic field just randomly collapsed, the sun would strip the Earth of its atmosphere, and all life on the planet would just get roasted instantly.
Whenever we go through a polar shift, we go through a void space as we change our frequencies for about 3.5 days. This is also in the Troano document depicted by 3.5 stones painted black. This refers to a time when we go through what science calls the electromagnetic null zone. During the pole shift, a phenomenon takes place where everything just seems to disappear for a certain time.
You're not even getting your own story right. The electromagnetic null zone is supposed to be a place where electricity doesn't work for 5 days. It's not like a dimension the Earth can f***ing travel to.
And we got sucked into the void space without protection. This resulted in us losing our memories. Science realizes that all of our memories are connected through cells in our brains as well as fields around our heads.
You keep claiming that science says things that science doesn't say.
What is not entirely understood by science yet, at least not directly, is the connection our memories have with the planet itself. The magnetics of the Earth affect how we think and act.
Yeah, it can affect our mood and behavior to a certain degree, but it can't literally wipe our memory.
When we existed on Atlantis, we were living at a very high level of consciousness in a higher dimension. We had extremely advanced and sophisticated bodies and minds, and were capable of practically anything, living in a dimension where molecules were spaced so far apart that consciousness could interact with them without physically moving.
So we used to be gods that lived in a different dimension. Okay, this story's starting to make sense.
But then we fell. We dropped back down to this place called the third dimension. We also fell in consciousness back to zero. We forgot how to use the pineal gland, and it slowly shrunk to the size it is now, like a raisin. We forgot how to breathe source energy into our bodies, and our lifespans went kaput, from 900 years to what it is today. We were kind of like a supercomputer that gets completely wiped. No operating system or anything. We had these advanced physical bodies, but we didn't know how to use them. This is why today we are so physically advanced compared to pretty much all the other animals in this third dimension.
Humans have one of the weakest and most vulnerable bodies in the animal kingdom. Almost every animal you just showed on that list could kill us without even trying. Humans gave up having good bodies for having good brains. That was the trade-off.
The reason we're having such a hard time finding evidence of Atlantis is because for the most part, the events of Atlantis took place on a much higher dimension than our physical Earth exists on right now. This landmass did physically exist, but the Atlanteans were not inhabiting that dimension of its existence.
Oh, so even if we found Atlantis, there would be no physical evidence. And we're supposed to believe this story, why?
If the warship hadn't been protected by the Merkaba, the Nacals would have lost their memories. They retained their memories when the Earth came out of the void and began their work once more.
Okay, again, that airship is supposed to give the pilot omnipotence, which was a power that Thoth already had to begin with. So Thoth had double omnipotence, plus a boost of power from all the Nacals, and they selfishly only saved themselves?
We're going to begin bridging the gaps between this story and our current history.
I legitimately forgot this was supposed to be real.
Thoth, Ra, and the Ascended Masters had to wait for humans to just evolve themselves over a 6,500 year time period until they were advanced enough to actually receive this new information that they were going to provide.
This is so dumb. Why didn't they just help them right away?
Sometime in here was when the flood of Noah occurred. Because of the pole shift, the Earth went through an ice age. This is scientific fact.
It is a scientific fact that there was an ice age, but nowhere on that page that you just showed does it say anything about a pole shift.
When the ice melted, it would have caused massive flooding.
It would have if the ice melted extremely quickly. It is actually possible that that's what happened if you look into the Younger Dryas period. That could have caused localized floods around the world, but it wouldn't have been Noah's flood.
DNA is the physical manifestation of who you are.
Well, technically you're not wrong.
This is a chromosome. Basically, what this is lots and lots of DNA wrapped into this weird H-like shape. What Thoth tells us is that every level of consciousness seen here not only has its own consciousness grid, but its chromosome change as well. The primary physically visible difference between these DNA in all life is height.
DNA does determine height.
The first level has an average height of 4 to 6 feet tall. The second level, us, has an average height of 5 to 7 feet. Third are about 10 to 16 feet, which we are about to translate to.
That's something that all New Agers seem to say, that we're right on the cusp of a big evolutionary step. It's such horseshit.
Fourth is 30 to 35 feet, and the last is 50 to 60. This is a place in Egypt today called Abu Simbel. The first thing you notice is that these statues are huge, but with the information about the DNA, this paints a different picture. These beings would be in the 60-foot range if they were to stand. They were at the 5th level of consciousness.
You think those statues are to scale? If that's how big they were, then why's the door to that building so small? They can't even get into their own goddamn temple!
Archaeologists saw this and thought that it meant that the man was just much more important than the woman.
Smaller statues that accompanied a pharaoh would either represent his concubines or his daughters, who were less important.
When in actuality, the kings of Egypt had 5 different names, one for every level of consciousness. Some of the kings were even able to translate into different dimensions, and that's how they guided the population with the power of the gods.
Okay, no, that's not true. In Egypt, people would write their names in something called a cartouche. After every time a pharaoh, say, won a battle or achieved some level of greatness, he would change his cartouche to include his accomplishments. Just like Daenerys on Game of Thrones, she's the mother of dragons and freer of slaves, blah blah blah. Those are all accomplishments that a pharaoh would add to his cartouche over time.
According to today's top archaeologists and researchers, the Egyptians and Sumerians both began their civilizations right around the same time from each other. Both of these civilizations emerged out of nowhere with perfect writing abilities. When they first emerged, they were extremely sophisticated and clear, and slowly degenerated over generations.
The Sahara Desert used to be a jungle, and it was filled with people. But because of the Earth's wobble, the climate changed, and it just stopped raining there. The whole region turned to sand. People had 2 choices: migrate south and follow the jungle, or migrate east and join a giant civilization. Yes, they didn't start with nothing. They already had writing, they already had culture, they already had math, but they didn't start off perfect.
Thoth's son Tat formed a group called the Tat Brotherhood, which is a secret group that still exists today as protectors and keepers of the sacred temples.
Well, if it's a secret, then how do you know about it?
So about 6,000 years ago, some members of the Tat Brotherhood would wait until they would meet someone who could understand what they were going to teach them. When they found someone, they would just tune their frequencies to the 3rd dimension and walk up and tell them information flat out. They said, hey, if you do this and this happens. The Egyptians would say, wow, look at that. Then they would go underground, wait another little while, and repeat the process.
That's tedious and stupid.
As for the Sumerians, they also received a more detailed story by those who were assisting them. They said, this is the history of the planet, write it down. It's time for the story about the city under the pyramid. Keep an open mind about this because there is very little proof for what I'm about to say.
You say that now? You've already been talking for 40 minutes, for Christ's sake.
For over 40 years, Drunvalo Melchizedek has been studying human consciousness. In 1996, he was contacted by a source in Egypt who said that something incredible had been discovered. A stone stele came out of the ground between the paws of the Sphinx into the daylight.
And naturally, instead of going to the news, you told some weirdo in a ponytail.
They removed it and dug into the earth beneath the Sphinx. There they found a room with 3 tunnels leading off of it. One of the tunnels, which went to the Great Pyramid, had another tunnel coming off it, and it was shielded by a wall of light. Bullets could not pass through this field, and people could not even get close to it without feeling like they're going to die.
Now just let me know when you get to the crazy part.
The Egyptian government found a particular person who could turn off this field. They also had brought in Paramount Studios to film it, as they had filmed the opening of King Tut's tomb. The government wanted several $1 million from Paramount, but at the last minute they asked for an extra $1.5 million under the table. Paramount was outraged and they backed off.
What's $1 million to Paramount? Honestly.
Then, Drunvalo heard from a source again who was involved in all this, who said that 3 men shut off the light field and went inside. They found themselves inside a very large building that went on for miles underground, which was really the edge of a giant underground city, which was really just one giant building. A little while later, an Egyptian archaeologist named Larry Hunter began describing the same thing, but more detailed.
There's an enormous underground city complex beneath Giza, and there's no proof that it exists. How would you even hide such a thing?
We were at our lowest stage of our evolution. We were hitting bottom on the awareness road. Suddenly, out of the darkness, 3 men came to Earth to give us a little nudge.
That's clever.
Everything in ancient Egypt was synthetic. They had this entire civilization based around achieving heightened states of consciousness, but they had to do it through tools.
Tools! I need my tools!
This thing, however, was their most important tool, the Ankh.
The Ankh represents life. It's actually a core symbol of their religion.
They saw the Ankh as the secret to eternal life, and they used it not as a physical tool, but as an energetic one.
What?
They would use this form and Ankh their sexual energy.
What? I don't want to know.
Sexual energy is an incredibly powerful energy. We definitely abuse it today.
Yeah, some of us abuse it.
But what the Egyptians knew was that when you had an orgasm, a very large amount of energy bursts from your root chakra all the way up your spine to the top of your head, and then it gets released. What the Egyptians would do was when the spiral of energy hit their heart chakra, they would onk the energy out of the back of their body and over their head and back into their body, where they would keep the energy and retain a massive energy boost.
Jerking off all day is not going to give you more energy.
The first Atlantean to reach the immortal state was a man named Osiris, a man who was killed and cut up into pieces by his brother in an act of rage, and then the pieces were scattered. Osiris's wife and sister retrieved the pieces, and upon returning the final piece, they restored the creative energy flow and brought his spirit back into the body.
That final piece, by the way, was a penis fashioned from gold.
Through doing this, Osiris became immortal. This event, perhaps less exaggerated than the myths, actually did happen, and it took place on Atlantis.
No, Osiris was an Egyptian god like many other Egyptian gods, except he was part of their holy trinity. He was both the focus of their resurrection myth, as well as their divine impregnation myth. Again, golden penis.
Thoth was the one who introduced writing, and if you look at ancient Egyptian culture, it even says, Thoth brought writing to us, as well as many other things.
Yes, because they believed that Thoth was the god of knowledge. That doesn't mean he actually existed.
For 17 and a half years, there was a bizarre new ruler that completely changed how Egypt was run, and his name was Akhenaten. He was also, believe it or not, 15 to 16 feet tall, at least that's how he was always depicted, and had an elongated skull.
I know people like to imagine that Akhenaten was some sort of alien hybrid or something, but the truth is his physical appearance is the result of generations of inbreeding. His son, Tutankhamun, inherited even worse conditions.
Akhenaten abolished all previous understandings of God and tried to instill a one-God understanding in everyone. After 17 years, the majority of Egyptians revolted and Akhenaten was killed, soon to be replaced by someone else, returning to the old system. What actually happened? Thoth got the help from Ai and Tia, who were the first immortals from Lemuria, and got them to mate interdimensionally to conceive a Christ consciousness being, and Egyptologists find that Akhenaten came completely out of nowhere.
Yeah, because he wasn't supposed to inherit the throne, he was supposed to go to his older brother, who got killed.
Akhenaten used his time to bring Egypt back to a simple religion where there was one God, one reality. He developed a mystery school, with the intention of showing a small group of humans a way to ascend into the immortal state. Akhenaten's immortals became a group called the Essene Brotherhood. They first migrated to a place called Masada in Israel. There were two people in particular. You might have heard of them. Mary and Joseph? It was part of the Ascended Master's plan that they would bring in a being who would show the pathway to Christ consciousness. That man is known today as Jesus.
Yeah, and all that makes perfect sense, as long as you ignore the simple fact that everything Jesus taught completely contradicts Jordan's story.
According to what Thoth said, Mary and Joseph mated interdimensionally. Mary could have been a virgin, physically, but she mated with Joseph in a way that would allow a soul from a higher reality to come down to earth and have a human experience. Usually, this is impossible to do otherwise.
Oh yeah, normally it is.
There was a council called the Council of Nicaea, which was the syndication between the Roman political and religious authorities. Basically, the religious leaders and political leaders realized that they could unite and impose more influence on the people and control society through their unity.
It's a little misleading to give them such evil expressions. They were doing it to stop a civil war.
The symbol for Atlantis was 3 rings inside of the other. The inside were the Nacals, the middle ring were called Maya, and the outer ring were the Atlanteans. The Maya's job was communicating the messages from the inner circle out to the regular people of Atlantis.
That doesn't make any sense. Why can't the Nacals speak right to them?
Look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people.
Over the last few hundred years, a group of people have slowly monopolized the entire world into what it is now. There are 13 families that are among the richest families in the world. They have their hands in next to every organization and government and control over 95% of the money. They control our modern world from the very tippy top. Many of these families may have DNA that is different than the rest of the human population.
Don't tell me you believe in the reptilian thing.
It is speculated that they share DNA that was passed down from the Martian race or other species races.
So what if they are?
They contain no love or emotion and are completely power-driven.
Oh, Jordan, you're so prejudiced.
This brings us to the end of the human history story for spirit science.
Oh, thank God.
But of course, it's not really the end.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
What happens next is ultimately up to you.
Me? But I'm that name.
This story, while seemingly unbelievable and at times outrageous, does explain a lot.
Explain nothing. Thank you for watching. If you like what you saw and you'd like to see more Armored Skeptic, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you absolutely love me, you can support me on Patreon, or if you have a passing affection for me, you can buy my merch. Links are in the description.
Bye.